On a recent purchase, we noticed that one of the front fork seals on the bike was leaking. Today we're going to repair this leak by disassembling the fork and replacing the fork seal. Before starting removal of your front forks, be sure to support your motorcycle properly on preferably 3 points. A motorcycle scissor jack, as well as a center stand if equipped, should be used to support the bike while shifting weight to the rear to lift the front wheel off the ground. If your bike doesn't have a center stand, you'll need to block or in some way support the rear of the motorcycle securely. Preferably use a paddock stand, and then a scissor jack to lift the bike from the front of the engine. Always strap your motorcycle down when using a lift for added safety. Plan on renewing both front fork seals even though one is leaking. This typically is not an easy component to service, so replacing both when one of them fails could save you a tremendous amount of time later on in the riding season. Consumable items you need to purchase for your motorcycle for this job include new front fork seals, a dust cap seal, the O-ring for the fork cap, and a new crush washer for the bolt in the bottom of the shock that holds the dampening rod in place. You'll also need fork oil. Be sure to check your manual for the type and weight, a can or two of brake clean, as well as some general lubricant to assist in assembly. For reassembling the brakes and tires to the bike, you'll need some anti-seize for the caliper bolts and some bearing grease for the front axle. Now, we've already disassembled the front of the bike and are ready to remove the forks from the yokes, or sometimes called the triple tree.
So one of the first things we're going to do while the fork tube is still in the bike, in the case of adjustable preload on the front suspension, we want to mark where the preload is set. So I'm going to take the groove that's in the top of the fork and to where you put the screwdriver in to adjust the preload, and just mark where that is in relation to the rest of the fork cap. And also you can make a little mark here on the bottom to kind of give you an indication as to how many turns in the preload is set to, or you can count the number of turns out, because the next thing we're going to do is take all of the preload off of the fork spring, and we'll count the number of turns. 1 turn, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 1/4 turns, and we'll write that down. So the next thing we're going to do, for simplicity, we're going to leave the fork tube in the bike, and we're going to take the fork cap off. We're going to unscrew the fork cap from the fork. And it is going to pop up just a little bit when you get this unscrewed. There we go. Now we can see our cap, which is screwed to the dampening rod. There is a washer keeper in here for the spring, and then the fork spring itself. So the first thing we're going to do is just get this washer out of the way, and to do that you have to push down the spring and then slide the washer out. And the washer has sort of a horseshoe type shape, and it's dished as well. You can see that it's got a dish in it, and that dish sits in the top of the spring away from the cap. So set this aside. We're going to clean that up before we put it back in, get any dirt off of it, make sure everything's nice and clean. The next step we're going to do is remove the cap from the dampening rod. To do that, I'm going to screw the preload setting back down so I can see the slot where I can grab onto the fork cap, which is right there. I needed to screw these threads down so I could see those two slots where I can put some wrenches on there. So that's just a locking nut that holds the cap in place so that it doesn't slide around when you're adjusting preload. There we go. And your cap is off. We'll be replacing this O-ring washer, as you should always do when you're servicing your forks and you're taking that cap off. This one looks in good shape, but we're not going to chance that. So now we can remove the spring if you want, but the spring is going to be covered with oil, so I'm going to hold off and wait until we move over to the bucket in which we're going to catch all the fork oil in. So we're going to go ahead now and unbolt the fork from the triple trees and slide them down. So now that we have the fork removed from the bike, we can go ahead and dump the oil out of it. And the fastest way to do that is just turning it upside down. Want to make sure that we pull the spring out and it doesn't get damaged. And we'll let those drip some oil off of them. So the fork is out of the bike and on the workbench, and the first thing we want to do is clean up the parts. Did that with a little bit of brake clean, but we're not finished cleaning them just yet. I want to wait till we get it completely apart, the inner tube and the outer tube on the fork. But I'm going to start by inspecting the spring. I haven't come across in repairing forks, these springs break. They actually break in two at various points along their length. So what you're looking for is any cracks. A crack is a sign that it's about to go ahead and break. And then any rough spots when you run your hand over, a burr basically in the outside of the spring can be an indication as well that the fork spring is about to fail. So this one is in good shape, expected it to be, so we're going to set that aside. Now we can move to the fork itself, and what we need to do is get the shield, the rock shield, which is located right here. We're going to get that off. That's an 8mm or 5/16 bracket here. So we're just going to loosen that off, and we should be able to slide that straight up. There it is. Set that aside. We're going to clean that up, put it on later when we're done. So if you remember, this fork was leaking quite badly, so there's a number of dirt and things like that on the tube that are stuck there. So we're going to take a little extra care in cleaning the fork tube before we put it back in and we reassemble. So the next move now is to remove the inner tube from the outer tube. And to do that, we go to the bottom, and deep down in there, is a 6mm Allen key bolt that needs to be removed in order to separate these two pieces. In the other fork tube I did earlier, I found some real interesting debris or remnants of some sealant that was used on the fork bolts in the bottom, the bolt that goes through the outer tube to the dampening rod. And you're not supposed to use sealant on those bolts. There's a crush washer, and you're not supposed to reuse that crush washer. So what the issue is that 6mm Allen key bolt head that is in there very, very tight, and it is glued basically in place. So to get it out, we're going to use the impact ratchet. And I have the impact all set up, and just make sure it's going in the right direction. And we're going to hold it in there firmly and go ahead and take this bolt out using the impact. And that makes light work of something that if you had to do by hand is very painful and arduous. So there's the bolt that came out of there. I got lucky on this one. The previous one, the copper crush washer was actually glued to the bottom of the fork, and this one came out with the bolt at least. The last one I had to go and use some WD-40 to help dissolve the sealant or the glue that was there, and then pry the washer out. This one came out with the bolt, so we're good. But I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's actually some sort of thread locking compound or sealant or something on here. This one was nowhere near as bad as the other side, but the impact allows you to pull this out without destroying or distorting the bolt. And I haven't ordered another set of these, so we're going to reuse these bolts. So now we can go ahead and pull the fork apart. The dampening tube, or the dampening rod I should say, should come straight out. Now there may be a piece of this rod that stays in the fork, and it may not. We'll see when it comes out. Yep. So there's one additional piece that goes down on this end, which is aluminum and then has a taper at the bottom. So that piece is still in the fork. So be very careful that you get that piece out. Otherwise, you know, if you go to dump the oil out or, you know, lose that piece, your fork won't work properly. So we're just going to set this aside so we can clean it up, put some brake clean on that, and get it ready to reinstall. The next step is to get that piece out. And there's that aluminum piece that goes on the bottom of the dampening rod. So now we're ready to separate the inner tube from the outer tube. We're going to start by prying off the dust cap. Nothing holds this dust cap on except friction and compression. So we're just going to take a screwdriver and pry that cap off. Off it comes, into the garbage. The next thing we're going to do is remove a retaining clip, which is in there. It's in this case it's a spring gray steel, and all you have to do is use your screwdriver and pop it up on both sides, and it's fairly easy to do. These are designed to come out, and away they go. So spring is out. Save that. We're going to reuse this. Make sure it doesn't go missing. So now we have the fork seal, in this case the leaking fork seal, which is down in the bottom there, and the tube. And the easiest way to get this out is simply to use the upper tube like a slide hammer and go ahead and pull that out with force. And there you go. So here's what the inner tube looks like. This is the seal right here. We're going to go ahead and take that seal off. And this was the bad seal, so it's going away into the garbage. Actually, before you put this into the garbage, before you put this seal into the garbage, just hang on to it. You may need it to help you put the new seal in. I tend to use that. So we see we have this brass bushing that is on the fork tube, and this washer which goes up against the seal. We see that the oil is not in great condition, so we're going to go ahead and clean this stuff up and get it ready for reassembly. So there was a little bit of corrosion here on the dampening rod. Just took a little bit of emery paper and cleaned that up. Made sure that that corrosion was no longer visible. The rod is nice and smooth. Cleaned it up. With the dampening rod and tube, you want to make sure that the spring, the lower spring on the tube, is not cracked as well. It's in one piece. It's firmly in place. And then the seal on the dampening rod should take a little bit of effort to open up. It doesn't slide real easy. And then you just want to make sure you get all of the old oil out of the dampening tube as best you can. And now comes the dirty work of cleaning up the outer tube. So there's a fair amount of dirt and oil and things like that down in there relative to the rest of the bike. So what you want to do is make sure you get all of that out, and you make sure that there's no debris stuck down in that outer tube. So one of the tricks I like to use when it comes to cleaning out the inside of the fork tube is just to make sure that there's plenty of cleaner in there. Again, we're just using brake clean. And then I'm going to go ahead and insert a rag. And in order to clean the tube from top to bottom, I'm going to take a large flat-headed screwdriver and kind of put it in the center of the rag, and then turn it clockwise as we go down. And keep turning it clockwise. Get down to the bottom. Use a little bit of force. And keep turning clockwise now and start to pull the screwdriver out. And the rag will come with the screwdriver. Much like cleaning the barrel of a gun, you can get nice clean finish on the lower fork tube. Okay, so we're ready to start reassembly. And the first thing we're going to do is take the new seal and go ahead and get it from its package, put it on the fork tube. So when it comes to putting the seal back onto the inner tube, you want to take note of the direction. If there's a contour to the seal, something that is an indicator of which direction it goes, just take a look at and make note when you take the seal off of this tube. If there's a ledge, or in this case there's a little bit of a ridge and a flare. In this case, with this Triumph fork tube, that flare actually goes towards the bottom of the fork tube. But basically what we're going to do then is just slide this up onto the tube. We want to make sure that there's proper lubrication on the fork seal. Because we use the brake clean to clean everything up, it'll be a little bit dry, so we want to make sure that there's proper oil. Put a little bit of fork oil onto the tube itself, and that way things will slide better. And then we're just going to go ahead and insert that into our fork tube and set our seal. So there's a lot of different ways to set this seal down into the fork tubes. There are special tools that you can buy that are designed to go over the fork tube and slide down and hammer it in place. This particular one is for a 41mm Showa fork. But the issue is that as you have different bikes, they have different diameter fork tubes, and you can wind up buying special tools for all the different bikes. So what I found is that all we need to do is have something that slides over top of the fork tube itself and works a little bit like a slide hammer. And we'll use the old seal to help pressure the new seal down into place. That's why we hang on to that old seal. So we'll go ahead and set that on top. And this particular piece is actually part of the riser, or the handlebars on this bike, and that's why I know it's the right diameter to go over the fork tube. So we'll just go ahead and slide that down like a slide hammer, and until we get that fork seal in place. All right, now we can go ahead and put the retaining ring in place. You want to make sure that you can see the ridge that is in the upper fork tube, and that clip slides down and locks into that ridge. There's a definite click, and you can see it actually recess in there. Now that the seal's in and the retaining clip is holding that seal in, we can go ahead and put the dust seal on top of the fork. Again, all we need to do is put a little bit of lubricant on here to make it slide a little easier if the fork tube is dry. And then this seal, again, it's just a compression fit. It should just slide down and pop into place. You shouldn't require any more force than what you can exert with your hands and fingers, and it'll fit snugly into place just like that. So our seals are in. We're ready to reassemble the fork, and we're going to start with the dampening tube and rod, and we're going to slide it down. Now we want to make sure that that cap, that aluminum cap, is in place over the end, and because it can sometimes fall off, you hold it vertical. This one's okay. There's a couple of tricks that you can use if you can't get this cap to stay in place. You can put a little bit of grease down in the bottom, just a little bit, just enough to hold it in place. So like I said, you can use a little bit of grease to hold that cap on if you need to. The other trick is to just keep the fork tube horizontal, and go ahead and slide that dampening tube in all the way down, and hold that in place. We'll clean up the bolt that holds that tube in place. Make sure we don't have any of that gunk that was on the threads, that thread locker. Looks like red Loctite is actually what it looks like. Don't Loctite these. You shouldn't need to. The service manual certainly doesn't call for any sort of thread sealant on there. And I've never used it, never had a problem on those. So we're going to go ahead and take our crush washer. And go ahead and reassemble this. And everything should line up fairly smoothly. Shouldn't be an effort or a chore to get this dampening tube to start to thread in. And we get it as tight as you can get by hand. And then we'll go ahead and break out the torque wrench and get ready to torque that bolt in the bottom. So we have the fork tube secured and got our setup here to reach in and torque that Allen headed bolt that holds the dampening tube and rod in place. And this particular fork needs 24 Newton meters on this bolt.
So now that we've reassembled the two fork tubes, the outer tube and the inner tube of the fork, we're ready to add oil. Now this inner tube slides up and down inside the lower fork lower or the fork outer tube, and we want to make sure that this inner tube is as far down as it can go. It's completely against the bottom of the fork lower. So I know that this particular fork tube holds 469 milliliters or 469 cc's, and I read that in the manual, of course, or the shop manual. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure not only do we have the exact amount of oil that's required in the shock, but we're going to level that shock. And how we do that is not while it's in the bike. You do it on the bench, and you want to be able to hold the fork completely vertical. In other words, completely straight up and down. You don't want it off to one side or the other like it would be locked it back in the motorcycle in the triple trees. So I have my 10 weight fork oil here, and what we're going to do is put close to half a liter into this fork tube, and I know that that's too much, but we're going to use a fork leveling tool in order to make sure that we have the proper amount of fluid in the bike. So we're just going to go ahead and put that oil into the fork tube. We're going to work the dampening rod inside the fork tube to make sure that we've got oil sucked up into the dampening mechanism. What we did here is we pulled the dampening rod all the way out of the tube, and then we're going to push it all the way back down. And that's what we want. So that dampening rod is lubricated, and we've got oil situated in those galleries as need be. So now we're ready to level off the front forks, and I know we've put a little too much oil into this fork tube, but the point of it is that we're going to use this tool right here, which is a fork leveling tool, fork oil leveling tool. And this tool has a rod and then a plate which you lock in place. This tube or rod will suck up the oil to make sure we have a proper amount of gap of oil from the top of the tube. That's why it was so important to have the inner fork tube all the way down or collapsed all the way, is to make sure that we have the proper leveling measurement point. So in this particular case, I know that the forks here require 120 millimeters of gap between the collapsed top of the collapsed fork tube and the oil. So I'm just going to double check by setting my calipers against what my setting is here at the bottom. And there is a scale on this tube, but I just prefer to double check it with a set of calipers just to make sure that there's no room for error. And we're set at 120 millimeters. So now that we've got this filled, we're going to stick that in there like that. Hold the leveling lock on there, up there at the top. Make sure it's straight and flat, and go ahead and suck out the excess oil. And again, we want to make sure that the fork stays straight while we do this. We don't want to tilt it one way or the other. And if you fill up the syringe in the fork oil level gauge, that's fine. Just squirt it back in the bottle. It's clean oil. And stick it back in the fork and do it again. This ensures that you always have the proper amount of oil in your fork tubes, and the last thing you want to do is measure it. And I've done this, years ago. I used to use measuring cups, but it's not exact. You can't get it exact like you can with this particular gauge. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out. I filled up the syringe, pop that back in to the bottle, and squeeze the oil back out. And how you know you're done here, of course, is when no more oil can come out of the fork, and we're right there. You hear that sound? No more oil going into the syringe. So we're good. And now we have our fork tube full of oil. The next step is to put this fork tube back into the bike. We're going to do a couple things. First off, we're going to reach down and pull the dampening rod all the way up. There it is at the stop. And then we're going to go ahead and pull the fork tube all the way up. And we're going to hold this here and move it over to the bike. Gently put it back into the triple tree, being careful not to spill any oil out of the fork. So we've got the fork back in the bike, ready to reassemble the top part, which consists of the spring. Now the spring is directional. There's a top and a bottom to the spring, and you just needed to observe that when it came out. In this particular case, where the coils are tightly packed and it kind of tapers down at the bottom, that was the bottom of the spring. So we're going to go ahead and insert the spring over top of the dampening rod. Again, you want to do this a little bit slowly because the fork is full of oil. Don't need it splashing all over the place. So the next thing we're going to do is adjust the lock nut here, which needs a specific depth on the threads for the dampening tube. But if we just leave this dampening tube alone, what will happen is it'll want to slide down into the fork. So we need to take this retaining horseshoe washer and put it back in place. So we just slide that back on, and now that dampening tube can't slide down anymore. When we can make these adjustments. Now you have to consult your service manual, but I know that this particular nut needs to have a depth of 10 millimeters. So we need to make sure that the nut is screwed off of the top of the threads by 1 centimeter or 10 millimeters. We're happy with that. So the final consumable we're going to replace is this O-ring right here. We're going to remove the old O-ring on the fork cap. Slide it off, throw it in the garbage, and then slide our new O-ring on. So again, we used 4 consumables here. We used the fork seal itself, the dust seal, the crush washer in the bottom, and this O-ring seal up here. So now we're going to go ahead and put this on the dampening rod, and we just want to make sure that we grab hold of that nut, which is so carefully set to a specific depth on the threads. So once we get the cap on and touching the nut, and you'll start to feel some resistance, then we can go ahead and lock those two against each other, the nut on the bottom and the fork cap. There we go, and that's set. Now if you remember, we had to screw the preload mechanism down on the fork cap in order to get enough threads to show so we could grab it with our wrench. Now we need to back all that off. We want to take the preload away. And the reason being is it'll make screwing the cap
onto the fork a whole lot easier. And that's why we marked the placement. We took note of how many turns the preload mechanism was. And so if we just back this all the way out, it becomes much, much easier to put this cap down onto the fork. Use some force, some compression, and turn at the same time. And then once you get it started, go ahead and tighten that up. Snug. The caps on this bike are torqued to 24 Newton meters as well. So there we go. We can go ahead now and adjust the preload back down. Remember, we were 8 turns roughly. We see where the cap is, or where the mark was on the cap, and we can go ahead and crank that down. There's 1 turn, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And we're back to the original setting. So all that's left now is to adjust the fork heights in the triple trees and put the front wheel back on, that sort of thing. If you wanted to know how that was done, or you were unsure, just before you take everything apart, just take a measurement, I should say.
Leveling the forks in the yokes or triple trees is critical to a balanced suspension. Don't place any weight on the front end until those forks are locked down with the yoke pinch bolts. Replacing fork seals is a straightforward job, but you need to exercise caution. Remember to properly support your motorcycle when removing any wheel and secure it safely, or it will fall over on you. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. So good luck and ride safe.